The story of the Athabasca migration begins in a world of ice. Towering mountains and endless subarctic forests stretching across ancient Alaska and northwestern Canada. For thousands of years, small bands of Dene-speaking peoples lived across this northern realm, moving with caribou herds and reading subtle shifts in the seasons like a second language. Generations measured time not by calendars, but by the rhythms of migration. Freeze-up thaw, and the slow pulse of the northern sun circling the sky. Their homelands stretched from the Yukon River basin to the Mackenzie Mountains, a region so vast that a traveler could walk for months without crossing the same trail twice. Archaeologists trace their roots back thousands of years through microblades, bone tools, sinew-threaded seams, and the distinct linguistic fingerprints preserved in Athabascan grammar. These people watched the ice sheets retreat, the rivers carve new paths, and the forests creep northward like a green tide. In this shifting world, Athabascan ancestors refined a way of life built on small, flexible kin groups who traveled lightly and adapted quickly. Their lodges could be raised or dismantled in hours, their tools repaired beside a fire, and their trails adjusted with every change in animal movement. They lived in a land of extremes, where survival meant constant readiness, deep memory, and a reverence for the unseen patterns guiding the natural world. Their oral histories carried stories of giants, ancient floods, dangerous mountains, and lessons whispered by animals who walked ahead of humanity. Such stories taught not just morals but geography, climate knowledge, and the deeper truths of how to move safely through a landscape that rewarded respect and punished arrogance. Linguists call their language family Dene, one of the most complex and widespread on the continent, branching like a mighty river through centuries of movement. Even before their great southward migration, Athabascan groups had spread widely through the boreal forests, from the Tanana Valley to the edge of the tundra. Each group adapted differently. Some became master caribou hunters, others salmon experts, others skilled trappers of marten and beaver. Trade networks wove these distant groups together, carrying obsidian blades, ochre pigments, shell beads, and stories across thousands of miles. Winter gatherings reinforced kinship ties, where songs, dances, and origin stories were shared beside flickering firelight under the long polar night. In summer, families dispersed to hunting grounds, navigating by memory through rivers, valleys, and ancient ridge trails etched by generations of footsteps. Their knowledge of the land was encyclopedic, mapping every berry grove, caribou crossing, safe ford, and the subtle signs of storms forming beyond distant peaks. Yet even in this vast homeland, pressures slowly grew, climatic shifts, animal migrations, and intergroup dynamics nudging families into new directions. Between 700 and 1500 AD, something began to change in the subarctic rhythms that had guided Athabascan life for centuries. Warmer centuries caused forests to expand, altering caribou paths and reshaping the availability of key resources. Population densities rose as more families thrived in the improved conditions, creating new tensions over the best hunting territories along the Pacific coast. Trade intensified as luxury items like dentalium shells and copper reached far-flung northern camps. Southern rumors drifted north along these trade routes, stories of new lands with different game, warmer winters, and opportunities waiting beyond the horizon. At the same time, small-scale conflicts erupted between Athabascan groups and neighboring peoples, adding new pressures to move rather than fight. The Athabascan worldview favored mobility over warfare, and more than once, whole families simply walked away, rather than escalate a feud. These cultural values, adaptability, flexibility, and movement, would become the engine behind one of the greatest migrations in North American history. Slowly at first, small groups began exploring farther south along river corridors like the Liard, the Peace, and the Upper Fraser. These were not mass migrations but tentative journeys led by curious hunters, seasoned trackers, and elders with visions of opportunities beyond familiar territory. Every new valley carried new possibilities, new resources, and new dangers, each evaluated through the Athabascan lens of cautious exploration. Some of these scouts encountered unfamiliar peoples, exchanging gifts or warnings depending on the circumstance, but always returning north with priceless knowledge. In time, what began as small exploratory trips evolved into seasonal migrations, as families spent longer periods in southern hunting grounds. Each passing year, their trails stretched farther from the heartland, linking distant regions through a web of Athabascan memory and movement. Children grew up hearing stories of warm winters, lush valleys, and abundant game to the south, planting seeds of curiosity that would bloom into decisive action. By 1100 AD, Athabascan groups existed in a wide arc extending deep into western Canada, forming the northern spine of what archaeologists call the subarctic tradition. The most adventurous families began following the backbone of the Rocky Mountains, using its valleys as natural passages guiding them southward. These journeys demanded extraordinary skill, crossing glaciers, fording frigid rivers, and navigating dense forests where a broken snowshoe or sprained ankle could mean death. Yet record after record, from oral traditions to archaeological sites, suggests these families pushed steadily south. Generation after generation, they moved not as conquerors but as seekers, drawn by the possibility of new life in lands they had only imagined from trade rumors. In the shifting world of medieval North America, their movement became a river of people flowing steadily toward the southwest. Some groups paused for generations in central British Columbia, shaping new identities, dialects, and ecological expertise in these transitional regions. Others continued onward, guided by elders' dreams, animal migrations, or the promise of untapped hunting territories further down the continent. As they moved, they carried with them a rich spiritual universe, stories of women, animal teachers, earth-birthing mountains, and beings who shaped the world before humans arrived. These stories served as cultural anchors, ensuring that no matter how far they traveled, they remained Dene at heart. The migration was not a single event but a long, flowing process unfolding over centuries, shaped by environment, opportunity, and Athabascan tradition. By 1200 to 1300 AD, Athabascan-speaking peoples began reaching the northern edges of present-day Montana, Alberta, and the Great Basin. This marked a turning point, the gateway where the great northern hunters encountered a radically different landscape that would transform their future. For the first time, they saw broad plains stretching endless and open, skies wider than any northern horizon, and herds of bison larger than any caribou migration. These new lands required new strategies, new tools, and new relationships, setting the stage for the emergence of entirely new cultures. From this transformation would eventually rise the Apache and Navajo, two of the most influential indigenous nations of the American Southwest. But their story, rooted in the Athabascan homeland, was still only beginning its long arc across the continent. As Athabascan families pushed farther south, their hunters studied every new environment with the same patience they once used in the subarctic forests. The dense northern woods slowly gave way to more open valleys where sunlight lasted longer. Winter snows melted sooner, and new animals appeared that elders had never named. They followed river systems that acted like highways, carrying them deeper into the unfamiliar heart of the continent. Every bend in the river offered choices: remain, return, or continue, and most families chose to continue, trusting the quiet pull of opportunity. Long-distance migration became a generational rhythm, with children born far from their grandparents' homelands, but raised on stories of the northern lights and great caribou herds. Even as they traveled, they cached tools, marked favored campsites, and carved memories into the landscape, leaving traces archaeologists still find today. The farther they walked, the more their speech patterns shifted, producing new dialects that still carried the backbone of the ancient Dene language. Trade routes increasingly intersected with their path, bringing encounters with plateau, plains, and Great Basin peoples who wondered who these northern travelers were. To the Athabascans, these encounters served as early lessons on local geography, harvesting strategies, and the social landscapes they were entering. Some meetings were peaceful, with gifts exchanged and hunting techniques compared, while others ended with tense standoffs or brief territorial warnings. Yet the Athabascan instinct to avoid prolonged conflict often meant simply adjusting their path and continuing southward. By the 13th century, they entered lands where bison dominated the ecosystem, an extraordinary shift for people accustomed to caribou and moose. This new animal, massive, unpredictable, and moving in thunderous herds, forced innovations in hunting strategies and group cooperation. Athabascan hunters learned new stalking techniques by observing local peoples who had mastered bison hunts for generations. These lessons blended with their own northern tracking skills, creating a hybrid knowledge system adapted specifically to the evolving conditions around them. Seasonal cycles changed too, with hotter summers, sudden storms, and winters dramatically different from the long subarctic freezes they once endured. Tools changed as well. Bows grew more powerful, snares adjusted to new prey, and hide clothing adapted to the harsher sunlight and dust of the plains. Children raised in these transitional regions developed a new cultural confidence, comfortable in landscapes their ancestors never imagined. They grew up fluent in tracking bison as easily as their grandparents tracked northern caribou, proving how quickly Athabascan communities adapted. The migration was slow, not because they were lost, but because they were learning, evaluating which lands could sustain long-term life. Some groups settled for decades in intermediate regions, becoming the ancestors of later northern Athabascan nations, like the Sultana and other central Dene communities. Other families continued the southward pull, their oral histories filled with visions, dreams, and spiritual signs urging them into warmer lands. These visions often came through medicine men who interpreted celestial patterns, animal behavior, or unusual weather as indicators of future paths. By 1300 to 1400 AD, the most ambitious Athabascan migrants began pushing along the eastern edge of the Great Basin and the foothills of the Rockies. Here the terrain fragmented into canyons, mesas, high deserts, and grasslands, a mosaic that challenged even the most experienced scouts. They encountered new plants like sage, pinyon pine, and mesquite, each offering foods, medicines, and materials unlike anything in the far north. Water became both a blessing and a danger, found in hidden springs, deep canyons, or treacherous flash floods that carved the land with violent force. Navigation required not just tracking but astronomical reading, as travelers used stars and seasonal winds to understand regional shifts. In this era, Athabascan storytelling incorporated new symbols, describing lands of red stone, spiraling canyons, and great winds that breathe through the desert. These stories became cultural maps guiding later generations who followed the same expanding trails. The migration corridor eventually reached what is now the Four Corners region, where the world opened into one of the most complex cultural landscapes on the continent. Puebloan civilizations flourished here, with ancient architecture, irrigated fields, and deep agricultural knowledge passed down for millennia for Athabascans arriving from the north. This was not just new land, it was a new world. The contrast between mobile foragers and settled agricultural societies created moments of awe, curiosity, and sometimes tension. Athabascan travelers approached cautiously, studying every detail of these farming communities whose homes stood solid against the desert wind. Puebloan people, in turn, wondered about these northern strangers who spoke an unfamiliar language and traveled in small, quick-moving groups. Some encounters led to peaceful trade, with corn, pottery, and textiles exchanged for hides, meat, and obsidian blades. Other encounters produced fear or suspicion, as droughts and resource competition heightened anxieties across the Southwest. Still, these intersocietal relationships profoundly shaped the future, influencing the rise of both Navajo and Apache cultures. As generations passed, Athabascan migrants learned to weave new ecological knowledge into their traditional worldview. They mastered desert foraging, cactus harvesting, and the use of yucca fibers for cordage, sandals, and tools. They adapted their lodges into wickiups and other forms suited to the local climate, materials, and migration rhythms. Songs changed to weaving desert winds, red cliffs, and bison plains into the ancient northern cadence of their chants. The people were evolving, transforming from northern Dene into early versions of what would become the Apachean world. Yet, even as they changed, they carried the ancestral memory of the north, the long winters, the guiding rivers, and the stories of where they first came from. These memories preserved cultural unity across thousands of miles, linking the subarctic forests to the red rock canyons of the Southwest in a single story of movement. Around the 1400s, the migration branched decisively, with some Athabascan groups settling in the northern Southwest while others continued deep into the mountains and deserts. This branching created two major cultural trajectories, the ancestors of the Apache and the ancestors of the Navajo. Though related, these groups responded to the landscape in strikingly different ways, setting the foundations for distinct cultural identities. Those who settled among open plains and forested highlands developed patterns of raiding, trading, and seasonal movement that would define Apache life. Those who settled near Puebloan farming communities grew more interested in herding, weaving, and semi-sedentary living, which would shape early Navajo culture. Both identities were rooted in Dene tradition, yet uniquely adapted to the challenges and opportunities of their new homeland. Their story, the story of transformation, was now accelerating with every passing generation. By the time Europeans arrived in the 1500s, Athabascan migrants had become deeply rooted in the Southwest, fully adapted to a world far from their northern origins. But beneath every new custom, every new strategy, and every new name, their Dene hearts still beat with the memory of the long journey south. As Athabascan groups integrated into the Southwest's complex ecological zones, their daily routines shifted to match the new realities of desert, canyon, and mountain life. They learned to read the desert the way their ancestors once read snowfields, understanding how morning shadows revealed water sources and how bird flight patterns predicted shelter. They developed new walking routes that zigzagged between high plateaus and sheltered valleys, ensuring access to resources through even the harshest seasons. Children were taught to memorize landmarks carved into sandstone, arches, spires, and hidden springs, forming mental maps that replaced the forest trails of the far north. Elders began telling new migration stories that blended ancient Dene teachings with the vivid imagery of their new homeland. These stories included Redcliffe canyons shaped by wind sprit, mountain guardians who watched from distant peaks, and desert animals who became teachers in their own right. The transformation from northern hunter-gatherers to southwestern foragers and pastoralists continued steadily as families experimented with new subsistence strategies. Some groups adopted small-scale farming during favorable years, planting corn or squash near washes that held moisture after rare rains. Others focused on mobile hunting patterns, tracking deer, pronghorn, and bighorn sheep across rugged terrain that demanded careful planning. Seasonal movement remained essential, as groups relocated between cool highlands in summer and milder valleys or plains during winter months. This rhythm mirrored the flexibility that had always defined Athabascan life, enabling survival across extremes of heat, cold, drought, and sudden storms. Interactions with Puebloan communities intensified as Athabascan groups established regular routes through the region. Puebloans taught them new agricultural techniques, pottery forms, and strategies for storing food in rock alcoves where heat could not spoil crops. Athabascans introduced advanced tracking skills, northern-style hunting knowledge, and unique oral traditions that fascinated their agricultural neighbors. These exchanges formed a cultural bridge that reshaped both peoples, leaving fingerprints still visible in language, craft, and story today. The Athabascan migrants, who would later be known as the Navajo, began adopting certain Puebloan customs while maintaining core Dene identity. They wove new types of clothing, experimented with loom weaving, and learned architectural ideas that informed early Hogan designs. Though they borrowed techniques, their worldview continued to center on mobility, kinship, flexibility, and spiritual relationships with the land. Meanwhile, the Athabascan groups, who would later be called Apache, tended toward more mobile lifeways, orienting themselves around broader raiding hunting trading systems. These groups excelled at navigating wide-open plains, dense forests, and rugged mountain corridors, often maintaining greater distance from Pueblo settlements. Their mobility allowed them to exploit diverse ecological niches, from high-elevation pine forests to brush deserts and open grassland. Both developing identities remained deeply interconnected by language roots and shared ancestral memory, even as their lifestyles diverged. The transformation into distinct Navajo and Apache cultures was slow and organic, shaped not by sudden change but by centuries of adaptation. Archaeological evidence from the 1300s to the 1500s shows shifting settlement patterns, evolving toolkits, and new artistic expressions consistent with this cultural branching. Ceramic styles, basket designs, and trade materials reveal a blending of influences that reflected the Athabascan ability to integrate without losing themselves. Even their spiritual beliefs evolved to match the Southwest's dramatic landscapes, incorporating mountain deities, storm spirits, and sacred sites shaped by desert geology. The Athabascan concept of the universe, vast, relational, alive, mapped naturally onto the power of the Southwest's mountains, storms, and night skies. During this era, long-distance travel continued, with some groups moving hundreds of miles seasonally to maintain access to hunting grounds and trade partners. These routes created a network that linked the Great Basin, the Southern Rockies, the High Plains, and the Pueblo world in a single loop of movement. Families often crossed paths with different Apachean bands, exchanging stories, supplies, and news of regional changes. The formation of named groups, Chiricahua, Mescalero, Jicarilla, Lipan. Western Apache had not yet begun, but the foundations were already being laid in these migratory circuits. Each region shaped its residents differently, carving distinct social strategies and survival skills into the Athabascan cultural foundation. Groups living in timbered mountains relied on deer and pinyon harvests, while those on grasslands depended on bison hunts and the gathering of mesquite beans. Desert bands learned to find water using methods passed down through careful observation of soil, color, wind patterns, and animal tracks. Some Athabascan migrants became so skilled in desert adaptation that later, Spanish chroniclers marveled at their ability to travel where Europeans could not survive. Throughout all this change, the Athabascan language remained one of the strongest unifying threads connecting far-flung communities. Its core structures persisted, linking Navajo prayer songs and Apache battle chants to ancient northern roots, spoken centuries and thousands of miles away. The sound of Dene words echoing off canyon walls symbolized the enduring continuity of a people constantly reshaped by movement. By the late 1400s, the Athabascan presence in the southwest had solidified, anchoring them as major players in the region's cultural and ecological dynamics. Their skills as hunters, scouts, negotiators, and survivalists made them indispensable, sometimes feared, sometimes respected, always noticed. They developed new alliances, new rivalries, and new trade relationships that reflected their expanding footprint across the Southwest. This era also brought challenges, including prolonged drought cycles that strained resources and intensified competition between neighboring groups. Athabascan mobility, however, gave them an advantage in adjusting to these difficult environmental swings. Families would simply shift their seasonal rounds, relocate to more favorable valleys, or intensify hunting rather than farming during lean years. The culture's flexibility, a trait forged in the North, became its greatest strength in the unpredictable Southwest. As the 1500s approached, Athabascan migrants stood at the brink of another profound transformation, one they could not yet see. Strangers were arriving from across the ocean bringing horses, mettled diseases, and new political pressures that would reshape the entire continent. For the Athabascan peoples, the arrival of Europeans would push their cultural evolution into overdrive, accelerating changes already centuries in the making. But before that moment came, they had fully established themselves as distinct southwestern peoples rooted in the land, shaped by its power, and ready for the challenges ahead. When the 1500s opened, Athabascan groups had lived in the southwest for generations, unaware that their world was on the edge of new upheavals. The first signs came not through direct contact but through distant rumors carried by traders, describing strange people riding animals larger than elk. These rumors traveled faster than the newcomers themselves, moving from Pueblo to plains to Athabascan camps in stories half believed and half feared. Before Spaniards ever appeared in person, Athabascan scouts were already watching for unexpected riders on the horizon. Early encounters were rare and cautious, often observed from a distance without either side approaching. But the Athabascan instinct for reading landscapes helped them assess these newcomers long before formal contact occurred. They noticed the strangers' metal tools glinting in the sun, their unfamiliar clothing, and their dependence on large four-legged animals the Athabascans did not initially understand. Word spread quickly that these newcomers carried weapons that boomed like thunder and cut like lightning. Spanish horses became objects of wonder and wariness, inspiring stories about creatures that fused rider and animal into a single silhouette. When direct interactions finally began, Athabascans approached strategically, preferring observation, negotiation, and controlled distance. They learned that the newcomers demanded tribute from Pueblo towns and sought control of trade networks that had existed for centuries before their arrival. Athabascan leaders watched carefully as Pueblo communities resisted, adapted, or suffered under new pressures. Taking note of how the Spanish presence reshaped regional politics, the Athabascans' mobile lifestyle gave them a strategic buffer, allowing them to avoid the earliest waves of Spanish demands for labor and tribute. Their camps could be moved overnight, their food supplies diversified, and their social groups flexible enough to evade colonial reach. These advantages allowed them to observe the newcomers without immediately falling under their control. But European diseases did not respect mobility, spreading invisibly along trade routes long before the Spanish set foot in Athabascan homelands. Smallpox and other epidemics tore through the region, decimating populations and destabilizing communities from the Rio Grande Valley to the edges of the plains. Athabascan oral histories preserve memories of terrible sicknesses that arrived like wind without footsteps, striking distant relatives without warning. These epidemics caused social fractures, forced migrations, and power shifts that reshaped the Southwest long before open conflict occurred. By the mid-1500s, Athabascan groups had to navigate a world where trade, sickness, and politics were increasingly interconnected. The rise of the horse, once captured and mastered, transformed everything about Apache and Navajo mobility. Horses allowed faster travel, wider seasonal ranges, and greater control over hunting territories and trade routes. Among future Apache groups, the horse became central to raiding strategies, offering unprecedented speed and tactical advantage. Among early Navajo communities, horses were integrated into herding systems, enhancing pastoral life and strengthening regional connections. The horse intensified the cultural branching already underway, pushing Apache and Navajo societies into even more distinct directions. As Athabascan groups adapted, they established new settlements in the mountains, canyons, and plateau edges of the Southwest. Navajo communities expanded across the lands between the San Juan River and the sacred mountains that later defined their world. Apache bands spread into the mountains and plains of what would become New Mexico, Arizona, West Texas, and northern Mexico. Names like Chiricahua, Mescalero, Lipon, Jicarilla, Navajo Apache, and Western Apache slowly emerged as geographic and kinship markers solidified. These groups maintained linguistic ties but developed unique identities, leadership structures, ceremonies, and survival strategies. Their adaptation to diverse environments created specialized skills. Some became high mountain foragers, others plains hunters, others desert edge raiders. Despite these differences, all retained the ancestral Dene emphasis on mobility, flexibility, and relational balance with the land. Spanish chroniclers described Athabascan peoples as always moving, not understanding that movement was their greatest strength rather than a sign of instability. To Athabascans, movement meant survival, a philosophy rooted in millennia of adapting to shifting northern ecosystems. That same philosophical backbone now guided their response to colonial intrusion, helping them avoid the worst demands of early Spanish rule. Still, encounters with Spanish expeditions sometimes erupted into conflict, especially when colonizers attempted to seize captives or livestock. Apache bands quickly developed a reputation as formidable opponents, skilled in guerrilla tactics, deception, and landscape-based warfare. Spanish soldiers found themselves ambushed in canyon passes, outmaneuvered on open plains, and exhausted by enemies who vanished into mountains within moments. These conflicts hardened Apache social organization, emphasizing capable war leaders, fast communication, and deep territorial knowledge. Meanwhile, Navajo groups used a blend of adoption, adaptation, and selective alliance with Pueblo communities to negotiate their place in the changing Southwest. They adopted sheep and weaving techniques that became central to Navajo identity, creating a pastoral economy that brought stability amidst regional turmoil. Sheep transformed Navajo life the way horses transformed Apache life, anchoring their settlements while expanding their mobility simultaneously. As these economic shifts unfolded, Athabascan spirituality continued to evolve, incorporating sacred mountains, healing ceremonies, and new ritual forms shaped by their environment. Navajo ceremonialism grew into one of the most intricate healing traditions in North America, blending ancient Dene cosmology with local influences. Apache ritual life emphasized strength, endurance, and power, reflected in practices like the sunrise ceremony and the songs of mountain spirit dancers. Through all these transformations, Athabascan languages remained remarkably resilient, surviving colonial pressure, missionization, and displacement. Language preserved identity even when communities were forced to move, hide, or reorganize in the face of Spanish aggression. By the late 1500s, Athabascan peoples had become firmly rooted in the socio-political geography of the Southwest, influencing trade, warfare, diplomacy, and migration patterns. They were no longer migrants learning a new world, they were shapers of the world they had entered. But the 1600s would bring new waves of upheaval, including Pueblo revolts, shifting Spanish ambitions, and intensified conflicts that would test Athabascan resilience once again. Their long migration story, though ancient, was still unfolding chapter by chapter, shaped by every new horizon they approached. The 1600s opened with rising tensions across the Southwest, as Pueblo communities endured increasing demands for labor, tribute, and religious conversion under expanding Spanish control. Athabascan groups watched these pressures from the margins, studying how Pueblo societies resisted, negotiated, or suffered under colonial imposition. Their mobility again shielded them from the direct weight of Spanish rule, allowing them to choose whether to trade, avoid contact, or strike when threatened. Apache bands, in particular, used this era to refine their raiding strategies, balancing conflict and diplomacy to secure resources with minimal risk. Raiding was not aimless violence but a calculated economic system shaped by need, opportunity, and retaliation against colonial encroachment. Meanwhile, Navajo communities deepened their alliances with certain Pueblo groups, sharing technology, adopting crops, and offering refuge to those fleeing Spanish punishment. These relationships helped the Navajo refine their pastoral economy, blending sheep herding with agricultural techniques learned through trade and intermarriage. Navajo families built homesteads anchored by flocks, using seasonal movement not to survive scarcity but to maximize grazing lands throughout the year. The growth of sheep herding gave rise to complex weaving traditions, producing blankets valued locally and, eventually, across vast trade networks. Weaving became both economic power and spiritual expression, with designs embodying balance, protection, and stories of the land. As these cultural developments unfolded, Spanish control over Pueblo communities intensified, provoking rebellions, resistance, and growing desperation. Athabascan leaders carefully observed these conflicts, aware that any large-scale upheaval could reshape the region's political balance. In 1680, Pueblo nations united under a coordinated revolt that expelled the Spanish from the southwest, an event that would transform Athabascan futures as well. During this uprising, many Pueblo people sought refuge among Navajo groups, bringing with them knowledge, livestock, seeds, and ceremonial traditions. These exchanges accelerated Navajo cultural development, intertwining Pueblone and Athabascan practices in ways that deeply influenced future Navajo identity. The Navajo pastoral economy expanded rapidly, supported by agricultural knowledge now more readily available through refugee communities. Meanwhile, Apache groups used the disruption to intensify raids against Spanish settlements, gaining horses, weapons, livestock, and tactical advantage. The Pueblo Revolt created a brief window in which Athabascan peoples strengthened their autonomy and expanded their influence across the region. For 12 years, Spanish forces failed to retake the southwest, and during that period Athabascan societies flourished on their own terms. Navajo communities spread deeper into canyon networks, cultivating fields and building enduring settlements among mesas and river valleys. Apache groups consolidated raiding territories, negotiating with some Pueblo towns while pressuring others, forming fluid alliances that prioritized survival and mobility. This era of relative independence accelerated cultural distinctions among Apache bands, pushing them into more specialized territorial adaptations. The Chiricahua took advantage of rugged mountain strongholds, learning every pass, spring, and shadowed canyon that could serve as refuge or trap. The Mescalero mastered the juniper and pinon forests, harvesting mescal agave as a vital food resource that shaped their identity and seasonal cycles. The Jicarilla moved between high plains and forested mountains, developing trade and hunting systems linked to both Athabascan and Plains traditions. The Lipon extended south and east toward Texas, navigating between Spanish settlements, Plains tribes, and emerging raiding networks from Mexico. The Western Apache formed decentralized local groups that balanced farming, hunting, and raiding while maintaining flexible kinship ties. Each band adapted to its unique ecological niche, developing distinct lifeways while still speaking related Athabascan languages. This diversification resembled the early branching of ancient Athabascan migrations, once again proving how movement shaped identity. Navajo society, meanwhile, moved toward more stable patterns, cultivating a semi-sedentary lifestyle anchored by sheep, corn, and long-term settlements. Their hogans became symbols of balance, designed in harmony with the cardinal directions, mountains, and stories that defined their cosmology. Ceremonial practices grew into sophisticated systems of healing, protection, and harmony restoration, echoing ancient Dene themes while embracing new motifs from their surroundings. By the time Spanish forces attempted to return in 1692, Athabascan societies were stronger, more organized, and deeply rooted in their environments. The reoccupation of Pueblo villages by Spain introduced a new phase of tension, negotiation, and resistance across the region. Spanish authorities had learned from their earlier failures, and now sought alliances with certain indigenous groups to secure their control. Some Apache bands entered into uneasy trade agreements with Spanish settlements, exchanging peace for rations, metals, and access to markets. These agreements were pragmatic, fragile, and frequently broken, but they shaped the next century of relations between Apache hunters and colonial authorities. Navajo communities faced increasing pressure from Spanish-backed raids and retaliatory campaigns, leading to cycles of conflict and diplomatic compromise. Despite these challenges, Navajo cultural continuity remained strong. Supported by decentralized family networks rather than centralized leadership, vulnerable to Spanish manipulation. This decentralized structure confused the Spanish, who could not control a nation without a single ruler to negotiate with. Apache bands also lacked a singular leader, relying instead on respected war chiefs whose authority depended on skill and consensus rather than hereditary power. These political structures, shaped by Athabascan tradition, made colonization far more difficult in the Southwest than in regions with centralized indigenous hierarchies. Throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, Athabascan resilience frustrated Spanish ambitions, forcing colonizers to adapt their strategies in the face of persistent mobility. As the 1700s progressed, new forces would emerge on the plains, including Comanche power, Apache dispersal, and expanding trade routes, all of which would further reshape Athabascan destiny. The Athabascan migration story, once driven by ice and caribou, was now moving through horses, wool, warfare, and revolution, but the core principle remained the same. Adaptation, movement, and cultural endurance continued to guide a people who had crossed continents, survived empires, and reshaped every landscape they entered. The early 1700s brought a new geopolitical force into the Southwest as the Comanche expanded southward with astonishing speed. Armed with horses mastered earlier and more aggressively than most neighbors, the Comanche created a mounted empire across the southern plains. Their rapid dominance pushed other tribes into new territories, triggering cascading migrations, conflicts, and negotiations across multiple regions. Apache bands, once dominant hunters of the plains, were forced to adapt as Comanche power grew explosively across bison ranges. Some Apache groups were pushed southwest into tougher desert environments as Comanches seized grasslands essential for horse herds. Others shifted toward deeper mountain fortresses, using rugged terrain to maintain independence where cavalry superiority mattered less. This shift intensified Apache reliance on raiding strategies, transforming raids from opportunistic acts into vital mechanisms of survival and retaliation. These raids targeted Spanish settlements, frontier ranches, missions, and supply caravans, creating a tense cycle of violence, treaty, and betrayal. Spanish officials alternated between punitive expeditions and uneasy peace accords, struggling to control a land where every canyon concealed resistance. Apache leaders used diplomacy as strategically as warfare, leveraging alliances, threatening trade, or withdrawing cooperation to pressure the Spanish. Treaties often required the Spanish to provide food, animals, and goods to maintain peace, effectively making Spain a supplier to its own adversaries. This arrangement suited Apache groups, who could break peace when advantageous while using treaty periods to regroup, trade, and rearm. Meanwhile, Navajo societies were strengthening pastoral and agricultural systems, centered around hogans, cornfields, and vast sheep herd. Their economy provided stability without relying on extensive raiding, allowing for a different pattern of interaction with colonial settlements. Rather than primarily attacking Spanish communities, Navajos often defended grazing lands and negotiated exchanges through selective trade. Weaving industries became economic engines, while herd wealth measured power, security, and family prosperity. Navajo settlements became more spatially connected, forming clusters of households linked by kinship, ceremony, and shared resources. This network allowed them to withstand colonial incursions, droughts, and raids by reorganizing rather than collapsing. Navajo diplomacy relied on patience, misdirection, and local negotiations rather than centralized deals easily exploited by colonial authorities. Spanish officials misunderstood this decentralized structure, assuming peaceful relations with one group indicated peace across the nation. In reality, Navajo alliances shifted village by village, family by family, creating a dynamic system impossible for colonizers to fully control. Apache political organization was equally decentralized, but expressed through independent raiding bands instead of household clusters. Both systems frustrated colonial ambitions, proving that political flexibility was a powerful defense against external domination. This resistance was not always overt rebellion, but structural defiance rooted in Athabascan culture itself. The Athabascan worldview emphasized balance, mobility, and relational negotiation, rather than rigid hierarchies vulnerable to foreign control. These principles were originally shaped by life in the northern subarctic, where flexibility was survival, and now they protected southwestern Athabascans from conquest. As the 1700s continued, Spanish military strategies grew harsher, sending offensives deep into Navajo and Apache territories. Apache bands countered with hit-and-run tactics, disappearing into mountains where horses faltered and soldiers suffered shortages. Navajo families dispersed into remote canyons where hidden fields were invisible from above, ensuring food production continued even during war. Both peoples used the landscape as an ally, turning mesas, deserts, and forests into defensive networks that confounded foreign campaigns. Throughout this century, Athabascan oral histories recorded battles, escapes, betrayals, and survival teachings passed from grandparents to grandchildren. These stories preserved not only events but strategies, embedding military intelligence into cultural memory. Meanwhile, Comanche control over the plains introduced a new kind of regional economy shaped by horses, bison, captives, and trade diplomacy. Apache groups modified their tactics accordingly, sometimes forming short-lived peace agreements with Comanches to redirect raids toward Spanish settlements. These alliances were fragile, shifting rapidly with resource needs and power balances, reflecting a political landscape in constant flux. Spanish mission systems attempted to break indigenous autonomy through Christian conversion, labor extraction, and settlement control. Athabascans resisted missionization more consistently than most Southwest peoples, avoiding long-term mission residence except under extreme duress. Those who entered missions often escaped, returning to their families with knowledge of Spanish routines and weaknesses. This resistance preserved cultural continuity, preventing assimilation and enabling Athabascan traditions to survive colonial pressure. By the late 1700s, Spain's resources were stretched thin, and colonial authority weakened under increasing indigenous resistance, internal corruption, and external wars. Apache raiding networks reached further south into northern Mexico, while Navajo herding systems expanded steadily despite periodic military campaigns. On the eve of Mexican independence in 1821, Spain had never fully subdued Apache or Navajo peoples, leaving their futures wide open in the coming century. New political powers would soon rise, each believing they could succeed where Spain had failed, unaware that they were entering the same landscape shaped by Athabascan resilience. The Athabascan story, launched centuries earlier in the icy forests of Alaska, was now entering the age of republics, ranches, revolutions, and new colonial ambitions. Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821 opened a turbulent new chapter in Southwest history. As political authorities shifted, but the struggle for control over land and power continued. New Mexican governments inherited the same conflicts with Athabascan peoples but lacked the resources Spain once commanded to try to control them. Officials attempted diplomacy through trade policies and peace treaties, but budget shortages often led to broken promises, corruption, and resentment. For Apache bands, treaty payments of food, livestock, and goods became essential lifelines they negotiated through sharp political pressure. When these rations were reduced or cut entirely, raids surged once again, targeted at ranchos, towns, and supply caravans across northern Mexico. Violence escalated as local militias formed defensive coordinates, retaliating with punitive campaigns that often attacked villagers regardless of guilt. These reprisals deepened cycles of mistrust, pushing some Apache groups into long-term hostility while others negotiated new local agreements. Navajo communities faced expanding sheep ranching by Mexican settlers, leading to disputes over grazing lands, stolen flocks, and retaliatory raiding on both sides. The pastoral economy that had once insulated Navajo families now drew them into direct conflict over livestock wealth, territory, and resources. Mexican ranchers increasingly demanded military action against Navajo settlements, portraying them as raiders, even when many conflicts began with livestock theft by colonists. In response, Navajo leaders coordinated defense strategies, dispersing herds, hiding flocks in remote side canyons, and increasing trade with trusted allies for weapons and textiles. Ceremonial traditions provided emotional resilience, grounding communities through drought, conflict, and political upheaval. The landscape itself remained a central ally, as Navajo society withdrew further into defensible areas like Canyon de Chelly, Chusca Mountains, and remote mesas. Meanwhile, Apache bands continued to leverage regional chaos, striking where resources were concentrated and vanishing where pursuit was difficult. Mexican authorities increasingly shifted toward policies of elimination rather than negotiation, authorizing scalp bounties that incentivized killing regardless of identity or guilt. These bounties encouraged widespread violence, leading to massacres of peaceful groups and intensifying Apache hostility toward Mexican settlements. The brutality of bounty hunting echoed across Apache oral histories, shaping memories of betrayal and reinforcing resistance for generations. Many Apache groups began traveling further north or west to secure safe trade and strategic alliances, expanding their mobility beyond frontier zones. As the 1830s and 1840s progressed, Mexico struggled to maintain control over its northern provinces, weakening its ability to enforce treaties or protect settlements. Local leaders requested foreign help or negotiated private military contracts, revealing how unstable Mexican authority had become in the region. Across the continent, another power was rising, a nation expanding westward with rapid territorial ambition and a belief in manifest destiny. The United States viewed the Southwest as both resource and destiny, envisioning annexation of lands that indigenous nations still controlled. Tensions escalated as American traders, trappers, and soldiers moved into New Mexico territory, introducing new economic systems and political claims. The Santa Fe Trail connected Missouri to northern Mexico, bringing increased trade but also new competition for resources and influence. Apache and Navajo groups observed American presence cautiously, unsure whether these newcomers would be allies, enemies, or temporary visitors. Some early interactions were neutral or even beneficial, as Americans traded goods in exchange for safe passage through contested territories. However, American interest was not limited to trade. It carried the momentum of settlers, militias, and political agendas soon to overwhelm the region. In 1846, the U.S. declared war on Mexico, launching military expeditions that rapidly seized New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Unlike Spain or Mexico, the U.S. government possessed industrial-scale resources, permanent army units, and expansionist ideology that threatened indigenous autonomy more directly. Navajo and Apache leaders recognized that this new colonial power would not negotiate under the same conditions as previous regimes. The U.S. sought to incorporate the land itself, not merely extract resources through negotiation, which made indigenous independence incompatible with American goals. In the aftermath of the war, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo transferred vast territories to the United States, creating new political borders that indigenous nations never agreed to. These borders cut across traditional migration routes, hunting grounds, and trade corridors used by Athabascan peoples for centuries. US officials began lobbying for forced pacification, settlement confinement, and agricultural assimilation to transform indigenous societies into controllable populations. Reservation policies emerged as tools of containment, aiming to confine mobile peoples whose freedom was incompatible with settler expansion. For the Navajo, this pressure intensified disputes over grazing lands and herd control, leading to increasingly violent clashes with U.S. forces and settlers. For Apache groups, whose lifeways depended on mobility and raiding networks, reservation confinement threatened their economic and political existence. The stage was set for decades of warfare, displacement, negotiation, betrayal, and resistance as Athabascan peoples confronted the most aggressive colonial force they had ever encountered. But even as the United States prepared its campaigns, Athabascan identity forged through migration, adaptation, and resilience remained the central force shaping their response. Centuries of experience navigating new landscapes and hostile powers had prepared them for yet another chapter of survival and transformation, as the United States took control of the Southwest. Military officers were instructed to establish peace through forced compliance rather than negotiated coexistence. These policies targeted both Navajo and Apache societies, whose mobility, autonomy, and decentralized leadership made them difficult for the government to control. American commanders assumed they could isolate resistance by capturing a few leaders, not understanding that power in Athabascan communities was distributed rather than centralized. Navajo herds, hidden fields, and dispersed settlement patterns frustrated military attempts to cripple their subsistence base. Apache reliance on fast-moving raiding bands made them almost impossible to track using traditional army tactics. In response, the U.S. military adopted scorched earth strategies learned from earlier wars against indigenous nations in the plains and East Coast. They targeted food stores, crops, orchards, herds, and water access, aiming to starve communities into submission. For the Navajo, this pressure culminated in the campaigns led by Kit Carson in the early 1860s. Backed by New Mexico territorial officials seeking total control of grazing lands. Soldiers burned cornfields, chopped down peach orchards, seized sheep, and poisoned water holes to collapse Navajo autonomy. Families fled into remote canyon systems, using strategies refined over centuries to hide livestock and survive invasions. Yet the scale of the U.S. campaign overwhelmed even the most resilient defenses. As soldiers destroyed canyon strongholds one by one, facing starvation, many Navajo families surrendered. But surrender did not bring peace, it led to forced removal. In 1864, thousands of Navajo were marched on the Long Walk to Bosque Redondo, a distant reservation where they were expected to become sedentary farmers. This march echoed older migrations, but now movement was no longer chosen, it was enforced under threat of starvation and death. Bosque Redondo proved disastrous, with poor soil, scarce water, corrupt administrators, and relentless military surveillance. The U.S. government attempted to strip away Navajo identity by imposing European-style farming, banning ceremonies, and restricting movement. Yet cultural resilience persisted through clandestine songs, quiet prayers, preserved weaving patterns, and whispered teachings passed to children at night. Navajo leaders negotiated persistently, demanding the right to return to their homeland instead of being relocated elsewhere. Their petitions, diplomacy, and refusal to accept foreign land led to a rare outcome in U.S. policy, a treaty allowing return to ancestral territory in 1868. When families walked home, they rebuilt herds, replanted orchards, raised hogans, and revitalized ceremonies, transforming return into cultural resurgence. The Navajo story became one of forced displacement, answered with determined restoration, not assimilation. Meanwhile, Apache bands faced prolonged conflict due to their continued mobility and refusal to accept confinement. Reservation attempts failed repeatedly as Apache groups escaped, regrouped, and resumed raiding to survive under hostile conditions. The U.S. military designated Apache resistance as criminal rather than political, justifying mass arrests, executions, and campaigns of pursuit. Guerrilla warfare dominated the landscape, with Apache fighters using intimate knowledge of desert and mountain terrain to evade and strike. Leaders such as Cochise Victorio, Nana, and later Geronimo emerged not as kings but as respected war chiefs chosen for skill, courage, and wisdom. Each leader represented a different band, united not by central authority but by shared Athabascan strategies of adaptation and resistance. Cochise negotiated for peace but demanded sovereignty and safe homeland boundaries, something the U.S. refused to respect. Broken treaties, false accusations, and prisoner seizures pushed bands from diplomacy back into warfare. Victorio fought to defend homeland access to vital springs and mountain ranges, essential for survival in the desert environment. Nana, an elderly war leader, proved age-irrelevant in Athabascan warfare, leading astonishing campaigns of mobility and tactical brilliance in his 70s. Geronimo became symbolic of resistance due to repeated escapes. uncanny scouting skills, and refusal to accept foreign control over his people. Despite military bias, many U.S. officers privately acknowledged Apache excellence as strategists, scouts, and survival experts. But industrialized military force eventually overwhelmed even the most skilled fighters, leading to imprisonment of Apache bands far from their homelands. Some were sent to Florida and Alabama, where the humidity, disease, and distance from their lands severed vital spiritual connections. Even after final surrender in 1886, Apache prisoners remained in captivity for decades, their release delayed by political manipulation and racial fear. While Navajo rebuilt through pastoral resurgence, Apache communities endured fractured relocations, forced schooling, and dependency on rations. Yet even under confinement, Athabascan language, songs, and kinship structures endured through quiet teaching, oral tradition, and cultural secrecy. Across these traumas, Athabascan resilience did not rely on monuments or centralized leadership. It relied on memory, adaptability, and relational continuity. The story that began in the subarctic forests now spanned reservations, prisons, and rebuilding efforts across the Southwest. The Athabascan spirit persisted not by resisting change but by absorbing it without losing identity, reshaping each challenge into another form of survival. As the 1900s dawned, new pressures, boarding schools, assimilation laws, and land seizures would attempt yet again to erase indigenous autonomy. But the Dene story was older than colonial governments, older than borders, and older than any policy, and it would continue to evolve long after empires faded. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States intensified efforts to erase indigenous cultures through boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. Athabascan children were taken from their families, stripped of language, clothing, stories, and community ties, taught to fear their own identity. Hair was cut, names were replaced with English ones, and punishments were inflicted for speaking Dene languages or practicing ceremonies. These schools aimed not just to educate but to dismantle cultural transmission, knowing that the destruction of language could unravel memory itself. Yet even under surveillance, children whispered songs in hidden corners, spoke forbidden words at night, and shared stories that teachers could not erase. Elders later recalled secret networks among students who taught each other traditional prayers, protecting fragments of culture that survived despite every attempt to destroy them. In Navajo communities, weaving remained a form of resistance, with patterns holding meanings unspoken but understood across generations. Herding, too, became a language of continuity, linking families to their land through daily movement that no government could fully control. Apache groups fought to preserve ceremonies in secret, adapting dances, songs, and rites so they could be practiced out of sight of authorities. Their traditions, rooted in mobility, now found new ways to move beneath the eyes of assimilation programs. Even when ceremonies were banned, stories passed through families like underground rivers, sustaining spiritual balance amid oppression. Federal policies sought to break communal ties by privatizing land through allotment, dividing shared homelands into individually owned parcels. This attempted to destroy kinship-based land stewardship, replacing collective responsibility with fragmented property ownership. Many allotments were lost to fraud, taxes, or coercion, further shrinking indigenous land bases across the Southwest. Despite these losses, Athabascan cultures continued to adapt, using political advocacy, legal challenges, and community organization to defend what remained. During World War I and II, many Navajo and Apache men enlisted, not as supporters of U.S. colonial history, but as defenders of family and homeland. Navajo code talkers turned their language into a weapon of protection, using Dene grammar and metaphor to confound enemy codebreak. Their voices carried ancient linguistic pathways into modern warfare, proving that the language boarding schools tried to silence could defend nations others once tried to erase. Apache scouts also served as trackers and reconnaissance experts, using skills passed down from generations of resistance to aid U.S. forces in global conflict. Ironically, the same government that once persecuted indigenous languages and skills now depended on them for victory. These contributions fostered a new era of indigenous activism, as veterans returned home demanding recognition, rights, and sovereignty for their nations. They understood war, politics, and strategy, and they used this knowledge to challenge discrimination and assert treaty rights. In the mid-20th century, grassroots movements emerged across Athabascan communities, combining cultural revival with legal and political action. Navajo families rebuilt herds, revitalized ceremonies, and organized community schools that centered knowledge instead of suppressing it. Apache leaders pursued land claims, cultural restoration, and language preservation. Pushing back against decades of forced dependency, the 1960s and 70s brought bold assertions of sovereignty, inspired by generations of survival and by young activists refusing to accept colonial narratives. Language programs emerged to teach children what boarding schools once punished, transforming classrooms into spaces of healing. Elders became educators, storytellers became curriculum, and ceremonies became public affirmations of identity rather than whispered secrets. The Athabascan worldview, which had endured migrations, wars, and forced removals, began to flourish once again in public space. Communities revived traditional governance structures based on consensus, kinship, and responsibility to the land. Land stewardship programs echoed ancient practices of balance, showing how Athabascan philosophies could guide modern ecological restoration. In Alaska and Canada, northern Dene nations asserted land rights as well, connecting their struggles to those of Navajo and Apache relatives in the south. Across thousands of miles, Dene peoples recognize one another through shared language roots, cultural values, and ancestral stories of migration. Their unity was not political but spiritual, woven through oral histories that remembered mountains, rivers, and trails connecting the subarctic to the southwest. This continuity revealed that Athabascan identity was not defined by colonizers, borders, or modern nations, but by relationships forged through movement and resilience. Language revitalization deepened this unity by renewing the sound of ancient grammar spoken by children once again. Ceremonies reclaimed their place in everyday life, no longer hidden but celebrated as expressions of balance and strength. Weaving, carving, singing, farming, raiding traditions turned into social service, and even horse culture evolved into community programs for healing youth. Athabascan peoples were not returning to the past, they were carrying the past forward, reshaping it to sustain future generations. The migration that began centuries ago in the northern forests had never truly ended. It simply moved through each era, changing form while keeping identity intact. Today, Athabascan nations across North America continue to assert sovereignty, speak Dene languages, practice ceremonies, and honor the land that shaped them. Their story is not about disappearance, but endurance, not about assimilation, but transformation, not about defeat, but adaptation. The Great Migration remains alive in every word spoken, every trail remembered, every ceremonial song sung in the language of their ancestors. Wherever the Dene live, they still walk with the strength of those who crossed continents, survived empires, and carried their world through time, unchanged at its core. The Athabascan story did not end with treaties, boarding schools, or the creation of modern political boundaries. It continued through memory. Across Alaska, northern Canada, the Pacific coast, the plains, the Rockies, and the Southwest, Dene peoples remain tied by ancestral language roots, older than recorded history. These roots carry not only words, but worldview, a grammar shaped by relationships, reciprocity, responsibility, and balance. To speak a Dene language is to understand that every being participates in the world, every movement has meaning, and every place remembers who travels across it. This philosophy formed in the ice-shadowed forests of the north, where survival demanded respect for land, animals, and unseen forces guiding both. It evolved through migration, adapting to deserts, mountains, grasslands, and canyon walls, stretching across the continent without losing its core. Even today, Navajo herders speak ancient words to their sheep as they move them through mesa country at dawn. Even today, Apache runners whisper songs of strength and endurance taught by elders who once evaded armies in the same mountains. Even today, northern Dene hunters thank caribou in ceremonies that echoed the first Athabascan ancestors who walked behind those herds thousands of years ago. This continuity proves that culture is not preserved in museums or archives, it is lived through practice, spoken through language, and carried through movement. Every migration, whether forced or voluntary, reshapes a people, but identity remains when knowledge travels with them. Athabascan identity survived not because it resisted change, but because it adapted without surrendering its spirit. It welcomed new teachings, absorbed new landscapes, and transformed challenge into resilience, weaving change into continuity. The emergence of Navajo pastoral life was not assimilation, it was innovation rooted in Athabascan flexibility. Apache raiding was not senseless violence, it was a political and economic strategy shaped by centuries of mobile survival. Code talking was not patriotism alone, it was linguistic inheritance, becoming a weapon against oppression. Each transformation grew from Dene memory, proving that culture can grow stronger by adapting, not by freezing itself in time. Across the modern world, Dene youth are reclaiming language that was once forbidden, learning the stories that stand behind every word. They walk trails marked by ancestors, plant food in dry earth their grandparents revived, and sing songs once whispered in boarding school shadows. They study the stars that guided migrations, the plants that fed their ancestors, and the stories that teach how to walk with balance. Their teachers are elders, grandparents, weavers, hunters, shepherds, runners, and storytellers whose knowledge survived because it was carried, not stored. The Athabascan migration did not move people from north to south, it moved knowledge across time, shaping generations who never stopped adapting. The land remembers their footsteps from Alaska to Arizona, from Yukon to New Mexico, from subarctic rivers to desert mesas. The stories remember the caribou, the bison, the sheep, the horses, and the deep trails carved by centuries of survival. The languages remember every place the people passed through, carrying echoes of mountains, winds, spirits, and waters in their sounds. Migration is not a past event for Athabascans. It is a way of being, a worldview that understands that life requires movement to survive. Because movement is not wandering, it is listening to the land, responding to change, and honoring relationships that sustain life. The Dene did not simply migrate across North America, they mapped it with stories, songs, and survival strategies still taught today. Their memory travels through children who speak ancient vows with new voices, through elders whose stories span centuries, through lands that still hold their footprints. And as long as their languages are spoken, their ceremonies practiced, and their lands respected, the migration continues. The story remains alive in every Athabascan community that stands today, not as descendants of a journey, but as carriers of a journey still unfolding. The people remain who they have always been, Dene. Those who adapt, those who remember, those who survive.